You have lived your entire life inside a generation label without knowing where it came from, what it actually means, or why the people in it turned out the way they did. None of it was random. Every generation was shaped by the specific disasters, inventions, and cultural shifts that happened while their brains were still forming. The Lost Generation had World War I and a global pandemic. Boomers had post-war prosperity and television. Zoomers were handed a smartphone before they could drive. 8 generations, all of them explained. Here is where they actually came from. The Lost Generation was born between 1883 and 1900, and the name is not a metaphor, it's a diagnosis. These were the people who turned 18 and walked straight into World War I. Over 70 million people were mobilized. 8.5 million died in combat. Another 2 million died from disease before they ever saw a battlefield. The ones who came home changed in ways nobody had language for yet. Then the Spanish flu arrived. Between 1918 and 1920, it killed somewhere between 17 and 100 million people, depending on which estimate you trust. Nobody agrees on the number because the scale was too large to count accurately. The Lost Generation buried their friends twice, once in the war and once in the pandemic. The Great Depression finished the job economically. By the time this generation reached middle age, they had survived a world war, a global pandemic, and a complete economic collapse. The fact that they kept functioning at all is the most remarkable thing about them. They turned out resilient not because resilience was fashionable, but because the alternative was not surviving. The greatest generation was born between 1901 and 1927, and they earned the name. They grew up during the Depression, which meant most of them understood scarcity before they understood abundance. By the time World War II started, they were ready, not because they wanted war, but because they had already spent their childhoods being asked to endure things nobody should have to endure. 16 million Americans served. The average service time was 33 months. Around 671,000 did not come home. The ones who did came back and quietly built the most prosperous economy in American history. They did not talk about what they had been through. They just got to work. This was also the generation that got Batman, Superman, Hollywood's golden age, and the birth of the American suburb. They invented the version of normal life that every generation since has been either chasing or rejecting. The silent generation was born between 1928 and 1945, and they are the most overlooked generation in American history. They grew up in the shadow of the greatest generation, came of age during the Cold War, and were consistently told to keep their heads down and be grateful. So they did. They worked hard, married young, stayed married, and built careers inside systems they did not question. They were called silent not because they had nothing to say, but because saying it was not considered their place. What they actually did was survive the transition from one world to another without losing their footing. They were the last generation to grow up without television as a primary influence, and the first to raise children who had never known a world without it. That gap alone shaped everything that came after. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964, and there were 76 million of them. That number explains almost everything. After the war, soldiers came home, families started, and the birth rate exploded. The economy was booming, confidence was high, and for about 15 years, America felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Boomers grew up inside that optimism and then watched it collapse in real time. Assassination, Vietnam, Watergate, civil rights battles that turned violent in the streets. They had the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Woodstock, and the counterculture. They also had the draft and a government that lied to them repeatedly and openly. By the time boomers hit their 30s, the idealism had curdled into something more complicated. They had started as the generation that was going to change everything, and ended up running the institutions they once protested against. Whether that is irony or just how life works depends on who you ask. Generation X was born between 1965 and 1980, and there were fewer of them because their parents had discovered the birth control pill. They were the latchkey generation. Both parents worked. Divorce rates were climbing. After school, millions of Gen X kids came home to empty houses, made their own snacks, and watched cartoons or MTV until someone got back. Nobody was particularly worried about them. That turned out fine. They developed independence early because they had no choice. Gen X got hip-hop, punk, heavy metal, alternative rock, Atari, Nintendo, and the early internet. They were the first generation to grow up with personal computers in the house. Apple and Microsoft were built by Gen Xers who dropped out of the institutions their parents had spent decades building. They were called cynical and disengaged. They preferred to call it realistic. Millennials were born between 1981 and 1996, and they are the most blamed generation in recorded history for things they largely did not cause. They were the first generation to grow up with the internet, which sounds like an advantage until you consider what the internet looked like in 2001 when most of them were teenagers. They came of age watching two towers fall on live television, graduated into the worst job market since the Depression, took on historically unprecedented student loan debt to get degrees the economy stopped valuing, and then spent a decade being told they were failing at adulthood because they could not afford houses their parents bought for a fraction of the cost. They are also the most educated generation in American history, the most tolerant on most social metrics, and genuinely comfortable with a level of global connectivity that would have seemed like science fiction to every generation before them. They get blamed for killing industries. Most of those industries stopped offering value and priced themselves out of reach. Before we move on to Gen Z, tell me which generation you belong to, and one thing about your generation that nobody ever gets right. Generation Z was born between 1997 and 2012. They did not grow up watching the internet arrive. They opened their eyes and it was already there. Where millennials remember dial-up and the transition to smartphones, Zoomers have never known anything else. They grew up on YouTube, TikTok, and platforms specifically engineered to hold their attention as long as mechanically possible. The attention economy was built during their childhood and aimed directly at them. They are also the generation that went through a global pandemic during their formative years. High school in a bedroom, college on a laptop, first jobs on Zoom. The social infrastructure that every previous generation used to learn how to be adults simply was not available to them during the years they needed it most. The mental health data reflects that clearly. Gen Z is entrepreneurial, skeptical of institutions, and genuinely unsure whether traditional career paths are worth pursuing when a teenager with a phone can build an audience of millions in 6 months. Whether that is a problem or an adaptation depends on what happens next. Generation Alpha started in 2013 and is still being born. They are the first generation with no living memory of a world without artificial intelligence. They are being raised primarily by millennials, which means their parents are simultaneously the most digitally literate generation in history and the most anxious about what screens are doing to their children. The iPad Kids discourse exists because millennial parents are watching their own children do what they themselves did with television and finding it deeply unsettling in ways they cannot fully articulate. Generation Alpha will come of age in the 2030s. What the world looks like by then is genuinely unknown. What is known is that they are growing up faster than any generation before them in terms of information access, and slower than most in terms of unsupervised real-world experience. How those two things balance out is the experiment currently in progress. What do you think the greatest generation was, and which was the worst? Drop it in the comments below.